With the advent of World War II and the United States entering the war in 1941, well, there's once again a need for cheap labor that was sought overseas. And this is because many American laborers were now serving in the military to fight the war or working in wartime industries. And by the way, this includes both African Americans. They would be engaged in what's called the Second Great Migration, whereby millions of African Americans would leave the South towards jobs in the North, in the Midwest, and the Southwest. But also middle-class white women would now integrate in the factory system, whereby previously they were relegated to the home to do housework. You may have heard of Rosie the Riveter. This need for cheap labor would be directed south, the neighbors to the south of the United States. So that's Mexico, of course. So you have to look at this program called the Bracero program as parallel with the Second Migration and with, quote-unquote, Rosie the Riveter. This is all work done in the economy during World War II when there's a short supply of laborers in the United States. Okay, now in particular, the braceros, as they would be called, would work, of course, in agriculture. And you could kind of tell by some of these slides here, working in the fields. And these are some depictions of their recruitment and their journey to the farms in the West. Okay, so this is indeed what's called the bracero program. And by the way, bracero means literally arm, but it's a term to describe menial work or a menial worker. So this was forged as a bilateral agreement between the United States and Mexico because, as mentioned, there's a need for temporary menial labor in the United States as a wartime relief measure. And ultimately, you see 4.5 million Mexican braceros migrating to the United States through 2 decades. It would begin in 1942, 43, and continue until 1964. So first we have to look at the various push and pull factors that were involved in this diaspora of the braceros. Well, what about push factors first off? Again, these are factors found in the home country of the labor migrants. So during this time, there was widespread poverty in Mexico, especially in the rural areas where most of the braceros would originate from, right? They were also known as campesinos, right? The farmers in Mexico. That's to say, just your average farmer, not the wealthy farmers, but, more of the peasant, if you will, class. Now, also, another push factor is that Mexico, the government of Mexico, promotes the Bracero program due to the positive effects that's going to result. And this is largely in the form of what's called remittances, okay, remittances. And by the way, if you're not familiar with that term, it's spelled remittances, remittances. So what does this refer to? Well, basically, a remittances, when you have overseas workers, and certainly this applies today for many, let's say green card holders today in the United States, sending money back home. Well, a remittance is exactly that. It's money earned in one country only to be sent back home to the labor migrants' original country, right? And usually it's a case whereby, due to the fact that they're working overseas in a more developed country, economically speaking, once that remittance sent back home, well, it's actually, it bolsters the economy of that home country because usually that sending country, in this case it's Mexico, is more of a developing nation perhaps undergoing economic struggle with their economy. And therefore, the remittance is helpful in that regard, okay, because you have U.S. dollars being sent back to the families in this case, Mexico. And of course, when they spend that money, it circulates through the local economy, and the overall effect, it strengthens the economy of that labor migrant's home country. So therefore, in this case, Mexico wants to be the recipient of remittances sent back home from these braceros working in the United States. So therefore, the Mexican government is really going to promote this program whereby you see migrant laborers being sent to the United States. Now, in terms of pull factors, well, as I described earlier, there's a labor shortage due to the war. Many Americans are fighting abroad that used to work in the factories or in agribusiness, what have you. Of course, there's a need for cheap labor by the American growers, the American farmers, and hence you have that agreement being forged between the United States and Mexico. So from the braceros' perspective, or the would-be bracero, right, once they sign up, well, the United States would be the place where they could solve their economic problems, where they could achieve some economic stability. And of course, the money they earn working in the United States could be sent back home to their families. So therefore, the braceros saw this work in the United States as a remedy to their rural poverty that they experienced in Mexico. Now, I just mentioned this was a bilateral agreement between Mexico and the United States, and they had to agree upon conditions, both countries, right? And here are some of the conditions that were worked out. Number one, it's not permanent labor. In other words, it's temporary labor. The contracts will stipulate that they're going to come here, work for a duration of months. Usually it spanned between 3 to 6 months on that contract, only to return back to Mexico. Okay, so by the way, this is reminiscent of the sojourners from China, right, that came from the Guangdong province, if you recall. It's temporary work. And similarly, the braceros, should they decide to sign another contract, they could return to the United States, work for, again, a duration of months, and then return and even sign up for a third or fourth period. Okay, so again, the conditions here is that it's, number one, a temporary labor contract. The second condition is that fair wages must be paid. Okay, now let's remember it's cheap labor, so what's considered fair wages is likely very low, right, from the American perspective. All right, so we have to keep that in mind. It is still cheap labor. Certainly from the braceros' perspective, however, with the economy of the United States now recovered from the Great Depression, by the way, well, you know, the money in U.S. dollars is worth more than the Mexican peso, of course. Number three, the conditions in terms of living in the United States, the living conditions must be suitable and adequate for their habitation. They have to provide housing. They also have to provide food and transportation as needed. Okay? And again, it's a rotational system, meaning that the workers would eventually return to Mexico, but many came back repeatedly because of the allure of American dollars that's going to be earned. Now, still another condition that was put forth by the Mexican government is the insistence that Mexican citizens, Mexican nationals, cannot be subject to racial discrimination within the United States. Why are they saying this? Because Mexico is fully aware of the Jim Crow conditions that certainly African Americans, but even other ethnic minorities face in the United States. If it's not de jure discrimination, certainly they typically face de facto or customary segregation, even in the U.S. West and Southwest. Now, interestingly enough, the state of Texas also needed its cheap labor from Mexico. They needed braceros to work in Texan agribusiness. And indeed, you had many Texan farmers insisted that braceros be sent to their state. But let's recall, of course, Texas is a southern state. It has a deep history of racial discrimination. Jim Crow is part of everyday life. And even back then, Mexicans were not allowed in restaurants and restrooms and public areas. So due to all this, the Mexican government refused to send braceros to Texas, even though Texan agribusiness was demanding its influx of bracero work. Okay, and this is going to factor importantly, by the way, when we begin to discuss the historical construction of quote-unquote the illegal alien, as we will see. So let's begin to discuss the bracero experience as they migrated as labor migrants, of course, from Mexico to the United States, from the rural areas of Mexico to the rural areas of the U.S. Well, first of all, if you wanted to enlist in this program to sign up, well, you had to go to the recruitment center. And usually these were located near the border of the United States and Mexico. So you had to journey up there on your own. And evidently, according to testimony from interviewees, well, exploitation was immediate from the very beginning, even as you were being recruited. For example, though the recruitment process was advertised as free, well, all the braceros that were interviewed later stated that they had to pay up to 500 pesos to Mexican brokers. Okay, so what you see here is corruption in Mexico involved at a local level, right? Saying that you had to pay in order to sign up for this program. And moreover, the transportation that was supposed to be provided from the rural areas to the border, to the recruitment centers, well, the braceros had to shoulder the cost, even though it was, again, advertised as free. So again, here's more exploitation. So those workers who were accepted in the bracero program, they had to sign their contracts, and therefore they're sent to these processing centers within the United States. So they're sent to El Centro, Calexico, and El Paso. And then they go through this process as depicted here. Here's some braceros entering the United States. Here's some American recruiters here. And this one, you should take notice of this because this was described as degrading by many of the braceros. They were directed to strip naked, and then their bodies were thoroughly inspected for parasites, for venereal diseases, and then they're deloused with this DDT powder, as it was called, and it's meant to kill the lice on the body. So this is the experience that they describe here once they entered the United States. So these process centers were seen as the areas responsible in delivering a type of labor force that was promised with the bracero program. That is to say, a disease-free, unattached, because most of them would be young men, hardworking, and certainly, if you will, a subservient force of laborers ready to work for U.S. wages. That was the desirable labor force from the perspective of agribusiness.